Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Thank you also for the introduction. It's really a great pleasure and honor for me to speak to you this morning. Yes, as you have already heard, this conference is especially dedicated to solutions to climate change and especially how we can use carbon sustainably. Throughout the day, you will learn and discuss about the results of very great research projects that all deal with the question of whether and how we can manage to use carbon sustainably. To provide an introduction to this exciting day, I would like to share with you some basic aspects of why it's so important that we all explore and, where possible, also use solutions to tackle climate change, and why we need also to transform, especially the industry. To prevent irreversible climate change, emissions must be reduced to zero as soon as possible. To zero. The sooner, the better. The economy must therefore decarbonize as quickly as possible, or defossilize to be more precise. Three things are important. First, reducing emissions. Second, adapting to climate change. And third, absorbing and using CO2. Instead of letting CO2 enter the atmosphere, we should use it. Why can the use of CO2 be an opportunity for the industry? And for which sectors do we really need it? I will talk about this morning. How this can be done is also discussed here the whole day and tomorrow. Therefore, let me start why the industry must transform and how the changes must be done. Why do we need to transform the industry? That's exactly the aim of my talk. So we need to transform the industry, as I already mentioned, because of, first of all, climate protection. As I said, we have to reduce emissions immediately, as soon as possible. The sooner, the better. But we also need a modernization. In the German industry, we have a very old capital stock. We have and facing investment gap and modernization gap since many years now. So the industry is really postponing their investment decisions since many, many years. So what we really need is to overcome that and to invest into modernization and renew the old capital stock. And innovation, of course, is related to this and how what this means and also how this is related to the topic of your interest today. I will talk in a minute, but also the structural change, of course, needs to be mentioned, and the digitalization, which is, I mean, we are now here virtually together, is always the topic for all issues, but especially also for the energy transformation, for the decarbonization of the economy, and also the defossilization of the industry. Why climate protection? That's the first point. I just wanted to briefly highlight of what the current situation is. So we have to reduce emissions quite soon. This is just a barometer who shows how the current policies or the policies taken into account on a global arena are also transferred to global warming goals. So the emission reduction, which are now intended in the US, in Europe, everywhere, how this is translated into global warming and the mitigation potentials we are facing. This done by a climate action tracker, where you can really also look into the individual measures and how evaluated. That's quite interesting. If we are looking at the global warming potential or the projection by 2100, we see with the current policies we are not on track. We are still on a track towards 3 degrees Celsius level, which is far above of what we have decided in Paris, which means that we have to do much more in order to reduce emissions even more steeper and more sophisticated way. If we are looking at the optimistic net zero targets, we might reach 2 degrees Celsius, but the only scenario is really consistent also with the result of being below 2 degrees Celsius target is that we have to take the three actions, as I already mentioned. Emission mitigation is the first, but also the third one, that we have to take into account the absorption of CO2, or to use CO2 and get CO2 out of the atmosphere. You see here, these are the IPCC scenarios also confirming since many years that there is an issue, or showing also here the role of carbon removal. The impact is increasing over time, but it's also starting quite soon. So we have to take to account the potential options of carbon removal. And here the topic of your conference comes into perspective, where we have to look at what kind of carbon removals we are looking at. But before we are doing that, I just wanted to make a remark, also a critical remark on climate neutrality, because right now we have this term since many decades. Right now, there are so many countries now decided to become carbon neutral since many decades, but we see that the emissions are increasing and increasing, and that's not only because of not enough measures in many countries and the increased share of coal, the increased share of oil and natural gas, but also because there's an unclear definition of carbon or climate neutrality. So everyone interprets our goal or this term differently. So there is a scope for abuse. And what we see in the past is there's just an ongoing business as usual and an extension of fossil and fissile, so nuclear business models, just name it differently. That's one thing. And the other one is that only 25% of global greenhouse gases are accounted for within those regions committed to climate neutrality. And that is also not enough. But of course, then if those countries are really committed to climate neutrality, we need to make sure that the first goal is always to reduce emissions and not to neutralize it somewhere. That's not the goal. That does not mean we cannot really sequester all the CO2. We should not leave the CO2 in the atmosphere, but then only for those emissions, which we cannot really avoid, we have to take into account those technologies, which means the carbon sequestering, the carbon usage, as we are discussing here today. So we really need to avoid greenwashing and have to take everything we can do to make sure that the emissions are declining. The sooner, the better. And that's only feasible with a consequent energy efficiency, energy saving program everywhere, with an increased share of renewable energy all over the globe. If we are looking at the negative emissions options, so to say, so the carbon removal options, we have to distinguish between different kind of options. So of course, afforestation and reforestation is to tree growth, takes up, of course, the CO2 from the atmosphere. However, it's always important to prevent the existing and keep the existing forests we have, the existing, also the old forest, the rain forest and all the rest, keep them and preserve them all over the globe, and not to burn them and not to harvest them, but really to preserve them. That is the first thing. We cannot just plant a new forests and hope that this will avoid our emissions. We cannot plant enough, which we should plant, that's good. But in order really to have a substantial CO2 sink option, we really need to wait and have forests since many decades in order to have it on a safe scale. That's the one thing. So on the other one, we're talking about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for example. Plants turn into CO2, into biomass that fuel also power plants, and the CO2 is captured and stored on the ground. That's quite expensive. So, but bioenergy plays an important role for the full supply of renewable energy. However, it's always need to be sustainable. It should not really conflict with food production and the rest of biomass that is needed. So there is a priority of a biomass that should be used for different kind of priority options, and food is always the first one, and biomass at the later point of the priority scale. Nevertheless, it's an option. And biochar, it's partly burned biomass is added to soils, absorbing also additional CO2. It's it's an option, especially also for the developing countries. We did a study on Malaysia on looking at that. That's really an option. It's not a large amount, but we should take this also into account. Enhanced weathering, of course, that the crushed minerals are applied to soil for chemical CO2 absorption, ocean fertilization, and iron or other nutrients are applied to the ocean. That's increasing the CO2 absorption options. And what you are talking also here today is a direct air capture. CO2 is removed from ambient air through chemical processes and stored or used to other options. So that's what we have to distinguish. And here it's important to take these options also into account. If we're talking about sustainability, we have to look at the Green Deal, of course, which is now also driving our sustainability goals. Not those, I mean, we have 17 sustainability goals on a world scale, but the Green Deal has different options. And here I just wanted to mention preserving Europe's natural capital, transition to circular economy, zero pollution Europe, and the agricultural transformation, rural areas, and also achieving climate neutrality and the energy sector all means that so we have a fundamental framework right now to transform the economies in total Europe towards more sustainability, towards more renewable energy, more energy efficiency, but also towards a CO2 free and decarbonized, defossilized energy system, economic system, and the whole economy will be transformed in that way. And so looking at those goals, that makes clear that there's a long way to go still. Looking at Germany, we did a study for the Scientific Advisory Group for the Environment, where I'm also the co-chair. And what we did is a study on the carbon budget. Looking at the budget we have still left, and with the current numbers, it's approximately 6.7 gigatons of CO2 still left. So we are allowed to meet and not to overshoot our Paris climate budget or carbon budget. That means we would need much steeper, a much stronger ambition for climate protection for all different kind of sectors, not only related to the energy supply, as you see here, it's affected also, all other sectors are affected as well, but most strongly, of course, the power sector with the coal phase out, quite soon for coal phase out, and an increase of renewable energy, of course, and also the transportation sector with avoidance of unnecessary transportation, and also the electrification on roads and railways, for example. But as you see here, also the industry, and the industry has to reduce emissions also very steep. And if we take this carbon budget seriously, we need to defossilize the industry also very soon, which means in 15 years, 10 to 15 years. So we need to have the solution quite soon in the system in order really to provide the necessary solutions. Why modernization? As I said, climate protection is one issue, but on the other hand, we also know that the knowledge capital of the German business is less modern than in other nations. And the knowledge capital is an issue. And this is also related, especially related to the industry. Investment into the modernization of knowledge capital should be a priority as well. And looking at other countries, we see that Germany has, I mean, there are others also having a same level, but there are others doing much better. And this is why we strongly recommend to focus also here on knowledge capital and the German economy, which needs to invest in more into knowledge capital. And the international perspective is quite clear. And for the industry, for example, we see other nations doing much better. The knowledge capital stock that is compared to the gross value added, so the capital output ratio, is showing that Germany lags behind the other countries, both for the services but also for the industry. And we have to also drive our focus on. And why innovation, digitalization, and structural change? Well, we saw that we have this not only climate protection, digitalization is an issue, and innovation as well. If we're looking at the emission reduction potentials, as I already said, the carbon budget is very clear. So we need to do a lot in order to reduce emissions in all sectors, and different components are relevant. It's energy efficiency, so energy saving is crucial, the electrification of almost everything. So we need to increase the share of renewable energy. This renewable electricity needs to be used everywhere where possible, because that's the most efficient solution, and not to waste it. So there is a priority list of energy efficiency, energy saving, renewable electricity first. And then, of course, we need to look for those areas like the industry sector, where we have challenges in front of us, because heavy steel production or a chemical sector has different challenges in just green electricity, because we need to really have new technologies in order to make it feasible. But now, looking at the International Energy Agency report, they confirm what we are saying now since many years, but the International Energy Agency was always very much focusing on conventional energy. Now they shift, because this is right. Renewable energy becomes cheaper and cheaper, so it will make the largest amount of the electricity, 90% by 2050. That's pretty much in line of what we have shown in the past as well. There isn't key technology ramp. It's, of course, wind and solar, which is basic for the energy production, but also electric cars, and the energy intensity will decline. And this is important, because electricity is applied to almost all sectors. But you cannot use electricity everywhere. Here's also the International Energy Agency is looking at different kind of CCUS. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage also contributes to the net zero in multiple ways. So you see here a large amount from fossil fuel processes, bioenergy production, of course, also, and fossil fuel processes in industry. And that's quite also a substantial amount of million tons of CO2, which needs not only to be captured, but direct air capture and direct capture removal plays also a role. So we have to focus on this as well. It's not that a large amount that we are talking about, but of course we need to focus also on these technologies as well. Why is that? If we are looking at the so-called full supply of renewable energy, that means green electricity is produced. Efficiency first, of course, the renovation of buildings, so the energy saving of buildings is very important, but also the transportation, which needs to be electrified, a focus on the railway system, a focus on electric cars. But for those areas, and here now comes the industry also into place, is with the production of hydrogen, which is a great hype at the moment, but of course it has a role to play, especially in the industry sector, because here with the green electricity and electrolysis and the CO2 as a source, we create synthetic fuels and over methanization. And this is why it's important to look at this technology and to invest into this technology as well, because we need some kind of not only energy storage options, this is a long-term energy storage options, hydrogen and synthetic fuels, or power to gas, power to liquids, but it's also a power to chemicals. And it's also the need for a source or for fuels for those areas where we don't have or cannot use green electricity directly, as for the aviation, as for trucks, for some trucks, and also for the industry. The transformation, it's the last point of my talk, the transformation of the industry creates huge economic chances. And this is where your topics come into play. today. And the topics you are researching, you're doing research on is the investment in order to reach the net zero emissions, mean there's a substantial amount of investment that needs to boost the full transformation. Out of the corona crisis, this creates a lot of chances. So we should invest into those areas we need for the transformation. As you see here right now, the renewable electricity generation infrastructure, but also low emission fuel. Why do we need to transform the industry? So just to close, is because of climate protection, as I have shown. We have an urgent need to reduce emissions very substantially very soon. We have to improve the digitalization situation in Germany for all areas, but also for the industry. We need a modernization, especially the industry. So the investment is needed urgently in order to come the gap of investment and modernization and innovation and structural changes. And what we figured out in a study of the German Institute of Economic Research is that the effect of increasing public investments also drives private investment. So the investment, as you see here right now, on investment in environmental, education, housing, infrastructure, that's the area we are talking here as well, creates in billion euros, creates 2 billion euros after. So it's good spent money from the government in order the future technologies that we need, but also to create markets, to offer framework conditions, and get the private market ongoing and boost the private market, especially also for this area. So that's very important. And the strengthening of new technologies is an issue because we need, of course, on the one hand, the promotion of research. On the other hand, we need also private capital in order to get the investment into those technologies which we need. Game-changing technologies, that's batteries, that it's also storage technologies, that is also the CO2 usage as an alternative in the chemical sector as an alternative for oil. It's also and different and many more. I mean, there are many different technologies which are game changer, which we need right now because of these urgent emission reduction goals we have. The activation, the production potential of digitalization, that is artificial intelligence, industry 4.0, the data infrastructure, digital platforms, mobility of the future, mobility as a service. So we need the effective climate change mitigations, low emission industry sector, CCS as well as CCU, but also bioeconomy, promoting lightweighting, which is also important. So the investment brings huge economic chances. They will create technological competitive advantages. There will be a lot of investment needed in the coming decades for the sustainable energy and mobility markets that create all value added and jobs. It's investment into energy efficiency. It creates competitive advantages, is not only because of falling energy costs, but also because of innovation and technological progress. Also, the chemistry and mechanical engineering can benefit from investments, especially also of innovative recycling systems, as you will also talk in this conference about new plastics and fuels and modern drive technologies. So there's a huge range of opportunities really relevant. But what we need is a clear signal. We need a regulation, climate protection goals, and reduction, of course, of distorting subsidies and regulation to get also the new technologies into the market. So the promotion of financial aid of new technologies is one thing. CO2 price, which we are now having already in Europe with now approximately 50 euro per ton of CO2, drives also some changes. However, this new technology is much more costly than 50 ton of CO2. So what we need a full range of different measures and concepts, carbon contracts for difference. With this, I would like to close this lecture, and thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all a very good day, very good discussions, and very fruitful new ideas for the research projects we are discussing and showing and also doing in the future. I think you're very important, a very important technology that you are developing. We need that very soon. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I wish you all a great conference today and tomorrow. Have a good time. Thank you.